Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage your moderator and distinguished panelists.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to the Per Jacobsson lecture. And if I could ask Geeta Gopinath, First Deputy Managing Director, to inaugurate the proceedings.
Hello, and welcome everyone to the Per Jacobsson lecture. Per Jacobsson was a former IMF managing director, a legendary managing director, and he devoted his life to promoting economic and monetary cooperation. So the foundation that was created, the Per Jacobsson Foundation, was created to propagate his legacy, and that was established in 1963. And we've had several chairs of the foundation. Our new chair is Raghuram Rajan, who was former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, and now, and for many years, a distinguished professor at Chicago Booth School of Business. As I'm playing an interim role here as the president of the foundation, but I would like to pay my tribute to Antoinette Saé, our former deputy managing director, who held the position of president for 4 years. Very briefly, the topic for today is reimagining trade, which obviously fits this, the purpose of this lecture in terms of bringing about economic and global cooperation. I can't think of a better time to have this discussion on reimagining trade. We are at a point in global international ties where trade is nothing like what it has been for the last several decades. Trade has contributed immensely to lifting hundreds and millions of people out of poverty, and all countries, without exception, have benefited from their trade engagements overall. Now, that said, there are some increasing set of concerns that have been attributed to the way global integration takes place, and especially with concerns on the increase in inequality because of some communities being left behind in terms of when countries opened up to trade, but also more recently in terms of the risks, the security risks coming from open trade, the potential to have disruptions to your supply chains, national security concerns. All of that has become much more salient now after the pandemic and after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These are important concerns, and countries are taking measures. But the risk, of course, is that this develops in an uncontrolled way, and you have too many trade restrictions in place, and you have basically an outright shift to protectionism. So in any case, I think this is very important for us to be reimagining trade, and I cannot think of a better speaker than Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, she's the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and frankly, well known to pretty much everybody in the economics and finance community. With this, I'm going to hand it back to Raghu.
Thank you, Geeta. Thank you for introducing the lecture. Geeta's already talked about Per Jacobsson, an internationalist in every sense of the word. He was with the League of Nations, then at the Bank of International Settlements, and then as managing director of the International Monetary Fund. He saw world trade shutting down during the Great Depression and also helped it re-emerge after World War II. He played a vital role when the rules-based system was put in place to encourage cooperation and globalization. He was an internationalist in every sense of the word, and I'm glad that today we have as our speaker an internationalist who is in the same mold of Per Jacobsson. She has served as the World Trade Organization's Director General since 2021, formerly chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, served twice as Nigeria's finance minister between 2003 to 2006 and 2011 to 2015, and even briefly acted as the foreign minister. She had a 25-year career at the World Bank, rising to the position of managing director, and had an extraordinary contribution in many ways, both to her country and to the international system. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala has had too many first accomplishments and awards for me to do justice to all of them. We'd spend the rest of the morning talking about them. Just reading a summary of all that she's done leaves me totally awed. How can one person do so much? But having worked with her in the past, I can say that all of it has been accomplished with infinite grace, a remarkable feel for what is important economically and what is possible politically, and uncommon empathy for the disadvantaged. I think the world is lucky to have Ngozi leading the World Trade Organization at this very difficult time for world trade. She's already made progress on a number of difficult issues, even in a time where cooperation is diminishing across the world. And we're also extremely lucky to have her take time from a very demanding schedule to give the Per Jacobsson lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Raghu. Thank you, Gita, dear Minush, Maori, ladies and gentlemen. Well, what an honor to follow in the footsteps of previous Per Jacobsson lectures, all the more so in this 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference. And that's why I want to talk about delivering on new global challenges. How can we keep multilateral coherence whilst reimagining the multilateral trading system? We're living in troubled times, something that Per Jacobsson knew well. So far as trade is concerned, that may be the understatement of the century. The times are not only troubled, they are tense. Trade is sometimes blamed and scapegoated for poor outcomes that really derive from macroeconomic, technological, or social policy for which trade is not responsible. Trade policies and tools are being deployed not just to solve trade-related problems, but also to try to address security and geopolitical concerns. As unilateral measures or threats thereof become increasingly widespread, trade policy has been getting more restrictive. In recent months, the US, the EU, Turkey, and Canada have introduced new tariffs and countervailing duties on Chinese electric vehicles and other products, including steel. China has countered with WTO disputes and measures against EU products such as dairy, pork, and brandy, etc. We all read about this. These are now among the over 130 new trade restricting measures recorded by the WTO Secretariat since the start of this year. This number represents an 8% increase to the stockpile of over 1,600 restrictive measures introduced between 2009 and 2023, which as of last year were already affecting over 10% of world goods trade. In addition, WTO members initiated 210 trade remedy investigations in the first half of 2024, nearly as many as all of 2023. While not all will culminate in the imposition of duties, Investigations have a well-documented chilling effect on trade, and I haven't even mentioned subsidies yet. Frictions are manifesting as trade disputes. 6 of the 8 WTO disputes initiated this year deal with green technologies, particularly electric vehicles. I hope we are not on a path that leads us back to the sort of economic disorder that came before Bretton Woods that Raghu referred to, disorder that was followed by political extremism and war. It was precisely to avoid a repeat of such circumstances that the multilateral economic institutions were created. My concern today is that we have forgotten this lesson, that we have forgotten the good these institutions have done and are doing. Walking away from the legacy of Bretton Woods, including the trading system, would diminish the world's ability collectively and at national level to respond to problems affecting people's lives and opportunities. I will argue that there's a better path forward, reimagining the global trading system and the rest of the multilateral economic architecture to help us meet the technological, environmental, social, and geopolitical challenges of our time. To succeed, its various components must work in concert, an idea we have come to call coherence. In the 1940s, the overall thrust of coherence was that trade, reconstruction financing, and monetary policy making need to be in harmony with each other and anchored in institutions and rules across countries to promote growth, prosperity, and peace. Today, delivering lasting improvement to people's lives and livelihoods requires us to solve problems of the global commons. The notion of coherence across different policy areas would have made sense to Per Jacobsson. His convictions about sound money and its importance for durable growth and recovery were shaped by his own experiences. As a young man, he saw the collapse of global economic integration amid the First World War. From his position at the League of Nations in the 1920s, he witnessed the failed attempts by leading economies to establish effective international coordination on global finance and trade, a memory that echoes uncomfortably today. We know what happened when the downturn came at the end of the decade. Vicious circles emerged of falling output, deflation, banking and financial crisis, trade protectionism and retaliation, and exchange rate chaos. Countries retreated into increasingly isolated economic blocs. The experience of those years was seared into the consciousness of the officials who gathered in Bretton Woods in July 1944. U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau opened the conference by looking back at what he called, quote, the great economic tragedy of our time. I quote him, he said, "We saw currency disorders develop and spread from land to land, destroying the basis for international trade and international investment, and even international faith. In their wake, we saw unemployment and wretchedness, idle tools, wasted wealth. We saw their victims fall prey in places to demagogues and dictators. We saw bewilderment and bitterness become the breeders of fascism and finally of war." The genius of Bretton Woods was that it turned the vicious circles of the 1930s into virtuous ones by recognizing that macro-financial stability, reconstruction and development and trade went hand in hand. Instead of beggar-thy-neighbor policies, countries would treat trade, monetary issues, and even domestic macroeconomic policies as matters of common interest. Instead of excessively rigid or chaotically fluctuating currencies, there would be orderly, rules-based management of exchange rates and balance of payments problems. Instead of underinvestment, there would be long-term financing for reconstruction and expanding productive capacity. Instead of quantitative restrictions, prohibitive tariffs, and bilateral clearing, there would be a coordinated lowering of trade barriers and freedom to undertake international payments and current account transactions. The idea of coherence across policy fields with trade as a unifying theme was baked into the system from day one. Promoting the balanced growth of international trade is written into the founding mandates of both the IMF and the World Bank, not as an end in itself, but as a means of higher employment, productivity, and incomes. The trade leg of the stool, alongside the bank and the IMF, was supposed to be the International Trade Organization, but it ran aground in the US Congress. A parallel negotiating process in 1947 produced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was nominally temporary and did not require congressional ratification. Successive rounds of GATT negotiations substantially reduced barriers to trade. The growing number of contracting parties used the GATT to resolve and avoid trade disputes. By the 1960s, global trade was growing faster than output. The decades that followed Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan delivered a breathtaking recovery from the devastation of the Second World War. Strong growth in the 1950s and 60s saw per capita incomes in Western Europe and Japan begin to converge with those in the United States. Major European currencies achieved full convertibility in 1958 when Per Jacobsson was leading the IMF. These gains, however, were largely confined to industrialized countries. Most newly independent developing countries continued to lose ground in relative terms as they struggled with declining terms of trade for their commodities. But a handful of poor economies in East Asia started trying to use increasingly open external markets to pursue export-led development. Coherence gave way to discordance in the 1970s with the oil shock, stagflation, the advent of floating exchange rates, and a wave of emerging market debt crisis. By the mid-1980s, the success of the so-called Asian tigers had become a compelling example, inspiring many developing country governments to pivot from inward-oriented to export-oriented development strategies. At the international level, growing frustration with ad hoc protectionism and a la carte approaches to GATT strictures created demand for more rules-based trade cooperation. The Uruguay round of negotiations from 1986 to 1994 broadened the reach of multilateral trade rules to cover services and intellectual property, filled long-standing gaps with respect to agriculture and textiles, and unwound much of the protectionism that had emerged in the preceding years. The nominally provisional GATT was transformed into the World Trade Organization with a binding dispute resolution mechanism that enhanced the predictability offered by its expanded rulebook. The preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO opened up new vistas for the organization, defining its purpose as using trade not just to raise living standards and create jobs, but to advance sustainable development, thus introducing the environmental concerns that were absent in the 1940s. And here I must say it was this purpose that attracted me to this job. The Uruguay round and the end of the Cold War would mark a second era of coherence and virtuous circles across the trading system, the World Bank, and the IMF. And this time, the benefits were spread much more widely across countries and people. The WTO became an anchor for outward-oriented economic reforms in many developing markets and emerging economies. Increasingly open and predictable trade became a stronger driver of development, productivity, specialization, and scale. Better macro-financial policies bolstered growth and trade performance in many emerging markets and developing countries. So did improved human capital and physical infrastructure. Trade and modern supply chains became powerful sources of disinflationary pressures. Market-oriented reforms in China, Eastern Europe, India, and other developing economies brought them into the increasingly global division of labor. Trade boomed, incomes rose, and poverty plummeted. Between 1995 and 2022, as low and middle-income economies nearly doubled their share in global exports from 16 to 32%, the share of their population subsisting on less than $2.15 per day fell from 40% to under 11%. Over 1.5 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty. Since 1995, per capita incomes in low and middle-income countries have nearly tripled, and global per capita income increased by approximately 65%. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, 2 centuries earlier, per capita incomes in rich and poor countries began to converge. Gains for poor countries did not come at the expense of rich ones. Examining the United States since 1950, researchers at the Peterson Institute for International Economics have shown that international trade boosted the economy by the equivalent of $2.6 trillion in 2022, about 10% of GDP. The gains from trade would be even larger for small, open, advanced economies. In a foreign affairs piece this year, Dev Patel, Justin Sandefur, and Arvind Subramanian called the years between 1990 and the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, and I quote, history's most golden period of economic development. They argue that the rapid increase in trading opportunities was perhaps the most important enabler of convergence. Research from our new World Trade Report backs them up. The pace of income convergence of low and middle income economies is strikingly correlated with their participation in global trade, as measured by a size-adjusted ratio of trade to GDP. Our simulations suggest falling trade costs account for as much as 1/3 of this convergence. To be clear, the period was not golden for everyone. Developing countries with lower trade participation or greater commodity dependence, mostly in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean and the Middle East, lagged on convergence. And in some rich countries, many people felt left behind, and their frustration started to fuel a political backlash against trade. Multilateral rulemaking on trade began to falter with the failure of the Doha round of WTO negotiations. Nevertheless, in 2008 and 2009, when the world economy faced its worst financial crisis since the 1930s, the system worked. International markets stayed broadly open. The rules and norms of the multilateral trading system helped governments contain protectionist pressures. Alongside fiscal and monetary support, trade was a powerful shock absorber. Crisis-hit countries could rely on predictable market access elsewhere to absorb their excess supply, preventing growth and development from getting derailed. The WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF also worked together productively on the macro-micro policy nexus. For instance, when trade finance dried up during the credit crunch, despite being extremely low risk, the three institutions joined hands to encourage G20 members and international financial institutions to step up with a $250 billion support package. Since the financial crisis, the multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core has continued to deliver economic benefits despite rising geopolitical tensions and tariffs between the US and China, the disabling of the appellate body, and the failure to reach agreements in long-running negotiations such as those on agriculture. Global trade kept reaching new highs through the 2010s, and over 75% of global goods trade continued and continues today to operate on core WTO tariff terms. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, the norms and rules of the multilateral trading system mostly did their job again. Trust in trade was damaged, yes, by initial missteps, as governments enacted export restrictions on medical supplies and vaccines. But governments generally refrained from widespread protectionism, allowing food and other essentials to flow across borders to where they were needed. Goods trade rebounded strongly from the lockdowns and was soon setting new records. Cross-border supply chains churned out products needed to fight the pandemic, from face masks to vaccines. Trade in digitally delivered services boomed, propelled by the same technologies that allowed so many of us to work from home. Goods, and especially services trade, are now well above pre-COVID levels. Last year, global trade was worth a near-record $30.5 trillion in a $105 trillion world economy. As we saw at the outset, however, these successes did not forestall the challenges we now face in global trade. While trade has been largely resilient, signs of fragmentation are now visible. So it's not difficult to imagine a return of vicious circles, trade restrictions, efficiency losses, slower growth, higher prices, costs imposed by extreme weather and food insecurity, and public frustration and anger. Allowing the vicious circles to take hold and the world to fragment into isolated trading blocks would be costly. The WTO has estimated longer-term global GDP losses in the order of 5% were the world to fragment into two like-minded trading blocks. IMF estimates are in the order of 7%. And the IMF has recently estimated that rising protectionism could cost the world about a percentage point in global GDP in 2025 and 2026. We cannot afford this. And that is why we need to reimagine the multilateral trading system to solve modern challenges and address modern vulnerabilities. This means also reimagining coherence. Trade alone was insufficient in 1944, and trade alone is insufficient to build a more secure, sustainable, and inclusive world we want today. The way forward for trade will be increasingly about WTO and trade in tandem with other issues and policies that support the original vision of coherence and that do not misuse trade tools for coercion or as a weapon to undermine competition. Our unfinished business from 1944 was elegantly illustrated by a recent blog post from the IMF chief economist Pierre Olivier and his team. They showed that China's growing and contentious trade surplus and the US widening trade deficit are the result of domestic macroeconomic forces, at least partly, rather than the product of trade and industrial policies. Homegrown surpluses and deficits call for homegrown solutions, they argued, suggesting demand-boosting measures in China and fiscal consolidation in the United States. As for concerns over industrial policy, they said the right response was to strengthen WTO rules, not to restrict trade. They cited the WTO's recent China trade policy review, which showed new data of billions of dollars in subsidies going to manufacturing, urging China to be more transparent about its subsidies. The blog shows the coherence mandate in action, but it also illustrates how even today, the global trading system is paying a price for shortcomings of macroeconomic policy. As Sylvia Ostray, one of my predecessors at this podium, said in 1987, and I quote, "Trade policy is no substitute for macro policy." Let's now turn to the new trade agenda and look at 3 areas where future prospects for people and the planet require trade to be reimagined and complemented by other policy levers pulling in the same direction. First, the environmental agenda, above all climate change, and getting to net zero by mid-century. Trade is indispensable to deploy low-carbon technologies globally. Trade lets countries share the burden of developing new green technology. Scale economies and competitive pressures associated with trade help drive down unit costs, making it possible for renewables to undercut fossil fuel energy. Trade also allows us to leverage green comparative advantage, a concept that our chief economist, Ralph Osser, sitting in the audience, has done much to advance. The idea is straightforward. Just as individuals and countries can reap economic gains by specializing in what they are relatively good at, the world can reap environmental gains if countries specialize in what they are relatively green at. If countries with abundant clean energy can produce more energy-intensive goods and services, whilst importing energy-like products from places where clean energy is scarce and vice versa, global emissions fall much more than they would absent that trade. And, in fact, research from the University of Zurich suggests that as much as 1/3 of global emissions reductions could come from this kind of specialization linked to green comparative advantage. As Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard has observed, fossil fuels are cheap to transport, but wind and solar energy are not. This makes parts of Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, with high green energy potential, attractive destinations for investment in energy-intensive industries, including the production of green hydrogen. Global cooperation on internalizing carbon costs would incentivize greener sourcing everywhere. Nevertheless, we already see moves in the right direction in Kenya, which has attracted $1 billion investment to build a geothermal-powered low-carbon data center. Parenthetically, a similar dynamic exists for water, provided it is valued correctly. A recent report of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which I co-chaired, shows that with trade, one can also promote the notion of a hydrological comparative advantage. Trade can help mitigate water scarcity by allowing countries with abundant hydrological resources to specialize in producing water-intensive products for export to water-scarce nations. Such virtual water trade offers agricultural export opportunities, for example, to those regions, including several countries in Africa with underutilized groundwater resources and land. But just as environmental policy coordination could accelerate climate action, policy fragmentation could weaken it. There is a genuine risk that trade frictions associated with carbon pricing, green subsidies, and other climate policies will escalate into trade restrictions and retaliation, harming emissions reductions as well as trade. We should seek to preempt such frictions and disputes by establishing shared frameworks for trade and climate policy. The goal would be to maximize emissions reduction and green innovation whilst minimizing negative spillovers, trade tensions, and wasted public resources on subsidy races that most countries may not even be able to afford to participate in. To this end, the WTO Secretariat is coordinating a carbon pricing task force comprised of the IMF, World Bank, OECD, and UNCTAD, and UNFCCC, where we are working to develop shared carbon metrics and ultimately a global carbon pricing framework against which we can benchmark national policies to aid interoperability of approaches. We've also joined hands with the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank to explore approaches to enhance greater transparency with respect to subsidies. And we are working with the steel industry to help them promote interoperability in decarbonization standards, reducing transactions costs, and facilitating trade and investment in green steel. Reforming the over $1.2 trillion in direct global annual fossil fuel subsidies, the $630 billion in trade-distorting agricultural support, and the $22 billion in harmful fisheries subsidies, which an agreement at the WTO is actually delivering, should be a no-brainer. Some of these resources freed up could be repurposed to support green innovation and a just transition to make the green comparative advantage happen and help reimagine trade. The second set of opportunities for the multilateral trading system deals with diversifying and decentralizing supply chains, and doing so in a manner that brings in countries and communities that remain on the margins of the global division of labor. More diversified global production networks would enhance supply security in an increasingly shock-prone world, while extending the benefits of trade to places and people that have not shared adequately in them. Greater diversification would also help lower the geopolitical temperature around supply chain relationships by making them harder for any single country to weaponize. As the pandemic and the war in Ukraine made abundantly clear, over-concentration makes supply chains vulnerable in crisis. The advent of COVID-19 concentrated minds on the fact that 80% of world vaccine exports came from only 10 countries. This meant export restrictions in a few of them severely disrupted global access to vaccines, especially to Africa, which relied on imports for 99% of its jabs. Decentralizing value chains and building up pharmaceutical production capacity in developing regions, including in Africa, for instance, would make global supply base more resilient in the event of future pandemics, whilst more closely integrating those regions into the world trading system and making them part of a more prosperous and healthy world. Critical minerals is another sector where there are major opportunities to reimagine the way we do trade and to mitigate concerns about over-concentration in mining and especially processing, while stimulating growth in developing countries. Exports of minerals critical for the low-carbon transition, like lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths, have grown rapidly to reach $320 billion in value in 2022 and are set to increase much more in the years ahead. Africa, for example, represents 40% of estimated global reserves of cobalt, manganese, and platinum, and 12% of world export of critical minerals, but only 3.8% of exports of processed minerals. By investing in processing these minerals within the regions, including in Central Asia and Latin America, where they are found, we can promote value addition and job creation whilst removing supply bottlenecks that currently threaten to hold back the low-carbon transition. Furthermore, to the extent that this process is powered by green hydrogen and other kinds of clean energy, it would harness the green comparative advantage I mentioned earlier, and thereby help developing regions increase their share in world trade. It would be green growth and green trade, the re-globalization we want. Finally, there are areas where cross-border commerce is flourishing, but where new rules are necessary to foster predictability and lower barriers to entry for smaller businesses and developing economies. The fastest growing segment of international trade is services delivered across borders via computer networks. Trade in digitally delivered services, everything from streaming video to remote consulting, has quadrupled since 2005, reaching $4.25 trillion in value last year. These services have become an increasingly important driver of growth and job creation. The commercialization of artificial intelligence promises to further accelerate digital trade. A forthcoming WTO report describes how AI could reduce trade and transactions costs, improve supply chain logistics, and shift countries' comparative advantages. I always say the future of trade is digital, but the future of protectionism could be as well. Imports of digital services could become as contentious as manufactured imports have, or more so, inviting digital barriers that are even simpler to put in place than their counterparts for trade in physical goods. Putting in place some basic rules for digital trade would reduce the risks of such reversals. The 90-odd members participating in a plurilateral e-commerce negotiation at the WTO are now looking to conclude a first-phase agreement on a series of practical measures to facilitate digital trade, from common rules for e-signatures and payments to paperless trade and consumer protection. Tougher issues like cross-border data flows, a critical element in AI, will be dealt with in a second phase of negotiations. Delivering on this agenda for the future will involve strengthening all of the WTO's functions, monitoring and transparency, negotiations, and yes, dispute settlement. With respect to our dispute settlement system, we are working to reform it. The reform process has wide buy-in and talks are advancing, including on issues like appeal review and accessibility to ensure that developing countries can use the system. Nevertheless, there are delicate issues here around national security exceptions and how they'll be handled. It will take a lot of work. We need to negotiate and implement new rules in important areas like the environment. Some members are showing the way. New Zealand, Costa Rica, Switzerland, and Iceland recently agreed to liberalize trade in a list of hundreds of environmental goods, and they're trying to get others to join. We're working to get an agreement on investment facilitation for development, negotiated by 3/4 of our membership into the WTO rulebook. This agreement will help developing economies attract FDI by simplifying investment-related procedures and sweeping away red tape. We will also need to review existing rules to make them fit for purpose. Instead of members doing an end run around the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures to introduce industrial policies, it would be better to update that agreement. It would be better to update the agreement. It actually dates back to 1994, 7 years before China joined the WTO, a time where climate concerns themselves were barely on the radar screen, and the conventional wisdom was that state-owned enterprises were a fading relic of a bygone era. Members could decide to create space for subsidizing the green transition. Shared ground rules would help minimize negative spillovers and related trade tensions, whilst maximizing efficiency in the use of public resources. Friends, let me now conclude. As I said at the start, these are tense times for trade. There are political dynamics outside our control, but we can treat the challenges we face as opportunities to reimagine the global trading system. We can build global resilience whilst making the system more supportive of inclusive growth and environmental sustainability. We can make existing trade rules more fit for purpose rather than go around them or against them. And we can make new rules fit for the times. We can help developing countries left behind by the recent wave of global economic integration. We can have interdependence without overdependence. While nothing is ever easy at the WTO, we are moving in the right direction. We will manage what we can manage, control what we can control, and the rest we will keep pushing ahead. Over the past 10 decades, the multilateral economic architecture, including the trading system, has delivered a great deal for the world. We have reinvented it before. We can do so again for people and planet. Ladies and gentlemen, Nelson Mandela once wrote that, quote, "After climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb." I ask you all, let's climb these hills together. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful address. We have two fantastic panelists to discuss some of the themes in the address. First, we have Dr. Maurice Obstfeld, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and professor of economics emeritus at Berkeley. He has served as the economic counselor and director of research at the International Monetary Fund. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and has literally written the textbook on international economics, which many of us have read in our student days. There could be no better person to help us start digesting this address than Dr. Obstfeld. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Raghu, Ngozi, Manoush. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with all of you, and it's a pleasure to be here back at the fund. Ngozi has laid out a very rich agenda addressing the new global challenges of our era. First and most dangerous, climate change, but also digital trade, global public health, water security, and much more. On this 80th anniversary of Bretton Woods, she draws inspiration from our basic creation myth, how enlightened policymakers in the woods of New Hampshire in 1944 devised a system to promote globally coherent currency, macro, development, and trade policies that effectively supported global post-war reconstruction and revived world trade. Now, much of this is indeed true, and I would never denigrate the miraculous achievements of Bretton Woods, which we bequeath to us precious multilateral institutions, the fund and the bank, that continue to play central roles today, including in addressing new global collective action problems. However, the founding myth of what St. Maynard and company wrought in the summer of 1944 is not quite complete, and the ways it deviates from the full history underline how challenging it will be in today's world to achieve the coherent multilateralism that Ngozi advocates and that we so badly need. The fund and the bank were created at a moment when World War II still raged, but the outlines of the end had appeared, along with a future world order led by the Allies, but particularly by the United States. But while the Bretton Woods institutions had as a goal to restore world trade, the creation of an international trade organization, while envisioned, was not directly on the conference agenda. That came later in the Havana Charter in March of 1948. The IMF's focus was on currency, exchange rates, and the restoration of current account convertibility, as spelled out in Articles 4 and 8 of the Articles of Agreement. The global spillovers and oversight of broader domestic macro policies were not directly on the table. The hope was that the IMF's support of fixed exchange rates, coupled with capital account restrictions and potential multilateral lending, would give countries enough policy autonomy to maintain domestic full employment. That would be each country's contribution to global growth and stability. The Havana Charter was intended to complete the troika of policy institutions, but its failure to launch has lessons for today. Two issues were the provisions of the Charter and the changed state of public opinion by 1948. On the provisions, the Charter staked out a very broad remit for the ITO. Aside from obligations on trade, articles covered maintaining full employment, limiting payments imbalances, labor standards, enhancing productivity, and competition policy. This was a failure to read the room. The perception of possible intrusions on national sovereignty helped sink the ITO in the US and thereby in the world. In addition, the mood of the American public had changed since World War II. Like the British, who turned out Churchill in favor of a Labour government, US voters in 1946 elected a Republican Congress for the first time since the 1930 election. A leading Republican figure was the isolationist Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. When the Bretton Woods Agreement Act came before the Senate on July 19, 1945, Taft introduced two amendments that would have kneecapped the fund. They were both defeated. He was then one of 16 senators, 14 of them Republicans, who voted against the Bretton Woods Act. Notwithstanding its Republican majority, the Congress, spooked by communist gains in Europe, approved NATO and the Marshall Plan. But the US public was exhausted, it was focused on demobilization and the home economy, and even after President Truman was unexpectedly reelected in 1948 with the Democratic Congress, remember, polls can be very wrong, there was no appetite in the country to commit to an ambitious further multilateral project. At the end of 1950, preoccupied with a war in Korea, Truman withdrew the charter from Congress. The ITO died. Post-war tariff reduction was indeed a huge achievement, but it took place under the aegis of the GATT, which started in 1947 with 23 members, far below the IMF membership of 40 countries. It was not a Bretton Woods creation, and it functioned with no umbrella organization, and as Ngozi has pointed out, with no explicit authorization from the US Congress. The point of this story is that the post-war generation was not uniquely virtuous, nor are today's citizens necessarily uniquely self-centered. The fund and the bank were born fortuitously, if fortunately, in a unique political moment which turned out to be fleeting. Worse, the US could have gone in a much more isolationist direction than it did after the rejection of the ITO. In 1952, Taft, the same Taft who had voted against the Bretton Woods Agreement, was the frontrunner for the Republican nomination. And following 5 successive Democratic administrations, he likely would have won the presidency, had not Dwight Eisenhower, then the supreme commander of NATO, thrown his hat in the ring with the express aim of thwarting Taft. Failing that, the US might have endured isolationism along with McCarthyism in the 1950s, with global repercussions. My contention is that the US appetite for multilateralism and an outward-looking orientation has waxed and waned. It certainly retreated in the Nixon years. But another golden moment came in the 1990s after the Cold War ended. That brought the WTO, China's entry into the global trading system, and hyperglobalization. The period ended with the global financial crisis in 2008, though arguably the beginning of the end was the 9/11 attack of 2001. The Trump presidency and the COVID pandemic dealt further blows. The loss of trust in technocratic projects has been a global development. Populism is on the rise worldwide. Democracy itself is on the back foot. In contrast to the significant advance of democracy earlier in the post-war period, which I would hold to be another achievement of the Bretton Woods system and the GATT. We can discuss the forces behind these developments and the role globalization may have played, but they create an inauspicious setting for the ambitious program that Ngozi has set out, however well motivated by the multiple crises we face. Another lesson of the ITO failure is the danger of overreach. Coherence is indeed critical. When the US subsidizes green energy while the EU taxes emissions, there are positive and negative spillovers. US subsidies to domestically produced EVs as discriminatory industrial policy have a beggar-thy-neighbor effect on the EU. As emissions reduction, however, they have an enrich-thy-neighbor effect on the world. How do we reconcile these opposing elements in the most constructive way? Can we do so within the existing remits of our multilateral institutions? The efficient exploitation of green comparative advantage by market allocation is a desirable goal. It requires a uniform, agreed carbon tax methodology worldwide. And if we are realistic, this is not in the cards anytime soon. And if imposed by a global body, would be perceived by voters in many countries, perhaps in all countries, as violating national sovereignty. It is great news indeed that the WTO, the fund, the bank, the OECD, and UNCTAD will jointly apply their considerable analytic skills to these problems. But don't expect voters to appreciate the results of pointy-headed analyses by remote institutions unless governments are fully on board and can market the results politically. This looks challenging in today's world. Now, don't get me wrong. We need to know what we should do in order to work toward what we can do. When I was here at the fund, both the research department and the fiscal affairs department pushed forward on climate with Madame Lagarde's very strong support, despite being told repeatedly from outside the building and even from inside the building to stick to our knitting. We did this because climate is a core macro-financial threat, and the solutions have macro-financial consequences. And I think what we did has been borne out by the future direction of research in the building. But the leap from what we know to be good policy to policies that are politically feasible is one we have to consider as well. Implementation will require buy-in and skillful messaging from committed governments. How do we get there in the current environment of widespread voter frustration? The US election is less than 2 weeks away, and soon we may be confronting an even harder question. How do we get there when the country central to the achievements of Bretton Woods, which has sponsored a rule-based order for decades, is sabotaging that order, denying the need for multilateral action, and even denying the very problems that make multilateralism necessary? In a very few months, US policy toward allies and trade partners may be driven primarily by a zero-sum narrative of victimization in which the US, despite its impressive economic strength, is being stripped of jobs and wealth through trade. There are certainly both trade imbalances and unfair trade practices in the global economy. Several large countries, including China, are playing a role, but we should not conflate the two, which have different solutions. I want to endorse Ngozi's well-expressed insight, which was also reflected in the recent IMF blog by Pierre-Olivier, Jayla, Krishna, and Rodrigo, that, quote, global trade system is paying a price for the shortcomings of macro policy. This has happened before in the post-war era. Think of the Nixon shock of 1971. Think of the dollar appreciation under Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. Think of the developments prior to the global financial crisis, the financial froth, the global imbalances. Now, that price may become even higher if the US imposes universal tariffs, bullies trade partners in pursuit of concessions, expands its fiscal deficit, and takes steps to weaken the dollar, and if trade partners respond in kind. The pendulum may not swing back toward multilateralism until the global economy endures considerable pain. Let's hope that's not in the cards. But meanwhile, we would do well to consider how willing countries can best cooperate nonetheless, and how international institutions can reform in a world where, at least for a time, the US succumbs to the isolationist tendencies that have always been present and have never fully receded. Even outside the US, of course, voters will need to believe that new multilateral commitments are acceptable limitations to national sovereignty that will demonstrably and palpably improve their lives. There are no easy answers to these conundrums, but let's not imagine that we shouldn't be asking the questions.
Thank you very much, Maury. Grim, but very, very useful corrective to excessive optimism at this point. To round off this panel, we now have Baroness Shafiq. Hers is again a career of extraordinary accomplishments. She served as the president of Columbia University, the President and Vice Chancellor of the London School of Economics, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Permanent Secretary of the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, Vice President at the World Bank, Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. Wow. And she has been a member of the House of Lords as a life peer since 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, Baroness Shafiq.
Well, thank you, Ngozi, for a spirited defense of the world trading system and a clear reform agenda for the future. And it is such a pleasure to be here with Gita, with Raghu, with Mauri, and with so many former colleagues and friends in this room. I wanted to build on a theme from Ngozi's paper as to why is it that politicians so quickly reach for protectionism when faced with economic challenges. And I think there are four arguments that one hears, or four possible explanations for that. The first is the zero-sum view of the world, which Mauri alluded to. The second is that dealing with the underlying causes of other economic problems, like macroeconomic imbalances, is quite hard. The third is that dealing with the causes and consequences of income inequality and the need for redistribution is even harder. And the fourth is an argument about infant industries. And I want to say something about each of those four in turn. Let me start with the zero-sum view of the world. It's interesting, in the area of trade, the divergence between popular views and those of economists are probably the most divergent than in any area of economic policy. If you poll people, about half to two-thirds think tariffs and protectionism are a good thing, whereas only about 3% of economists think that. And we could all argue that they just need to read Ricardo and Adam Smith, and they'd understand that there are gains from trade, and comparative advantage is a beautiful thing, and we're all better off. But we clearly do need to do a better job, probably not Ricardo and Smith, but in slightly more accessible ways, to demonstrate the benefits of trade and create a more positive sum view. Because in fact, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank were essentially built on a positive sum view of the world, that cooperation resulted in improvements for all. But in this area, we have a lot of work to do, as Ngozi said, on public education around the gains from trade, probably more than in any other topic. Let me turn to the issue about dealing with macroeconomic imbalances is hard. Trade deficits are not a problem if you can finance them sustainably. And the causes of large trade deficits are often and usually about other imbalances. Trade is often blamed for problems that are often caused by things like the US fiscal deficit, or China's inability to shift to a consumption-based economic growth model. And dealing with those global imbalances around savings and investment in the world economy, often involves very difficult political choices, like cutting entitlement spending in the United States, or building a better entitlement system in China so that people don't have to save so much in a very aging society. Trying to avoid those difficult choices is, I think, an important reason why people go to trade and protectionism as a response, even though, ironically, protectionism makes solving those macroeconomic imbalances much harder in the long run, because your economy is less productive, grows less, generates less tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera. The third rationale, and I think the third explanation why we see this reach for protectionism, is around the politics of redistribution. Trade can be associated with significant disruption and job losses, but the evidence is that much of that disruption is actually caused by technology rather than trade. Those who have the skills to benefit from technological innovations and changes tend to do better, while those who don't tend to suffer. But the solution, of course, is not to stop trade or to stop technological progress, but to help people adapt. It is no accident that the countries that have the best social safety nets and active labor market policies to help workers adjust are the least likely to support protectionist policies. Workers are less afraid of competition because they know that they won't be left destitute. And if they do experience disruption, there will be active labor market policies and training programs to help them find new jobs. This has occurred in other countries. In the United States, when the NAFTA agreement was signed with Mexico and Canada, there was something called the Trade Adjustment Program. And it had all the ingredients that you would want to see in a social safety net to help cope with trade disruptions: reskilling investments, training, mobility grants to help people move to growing regions, investments in areas that were adversely affected. But that program was never funded properly by Congress, and so the burdens of the adjustment were borne by communities directly. Like in many other aspects of economics, we are very good at dealing with the efficiency gains of designing policies that increase economic efficiency. We're much less good at addressing the distributional consequences that might result from that. And that is, I think, an important lesson, particularly in trade policy. Now, the last argument that one hears to justify the rise in protectionism is essentially a version of the infant industries argument. Those of you like me who probably studied development economics in the 70s and 80s all remember import substitution industrialization, which was an argument that developing countries should protect themselves from trade in order to modernize their economies and allow their economies to industrialize over time without facing the harsh competition from the world economy. The irony is that today, it's advanced economies that are using import substitution industrialization arguments on the grounds of economic nationalism, national security, and a desire to address climate change. And so we have protection for renewables, for chips and AI technology, and electric vehicles. This is somewhat ironic because, as Ngozi said in her speech, organizations like the World Bank for many years have been advising countries to move away from import substitution toward export-oriented growth, as the East Asian countries did so successfully in the 80s and 90s. The big difference is that advanced economies can afford to finance bad policies for much longer than developing countries. And that is a big problem for all of us. So we need a better debate on the trade-offs that the costs that these bad policies imply, and a better debate about the alternatives to achieve these other policy objectives, like a modest carbon tax with a rebate for redistribution, or supporting research and development of new green technologies that will bring down costs, or incentives for investments in regions that are falling behind, or supply chain diversification. Things like domestic content requirements massively raise the costs of the green transition. And our objective now, if we want to really deal with climate change, is to achieve the green transition in the cheapest possible way we can. And of course, trade is a very important part of that. Let me conclude. There is a colloquial expression, use the right tool for the job. Trade policy is not the best tool for addressing fiscal deficits, income inequality, or national security issues, or climate. Trade is first and foremost about building competitive economies that grow, that create jobs, and that serve consumers efficiently. Today, we seem to be following a different expression, another adage, that if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so whatever economic challenge we face, politicians are reaching for the protectionist hammer to address the many nails in front of them. I think there are better ways to solve those nails: better fiscal policy, more creativity about supply chain diversification, R&D, building a better social safety net, investing in declining regions. So we need to go back to letting trade policy do its job and do what it does best, and widen our toolkit and use other policies to address the many challenges that we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent reassertion of the benefits of trade, but also the challenges that we face today. Ngozi, would you like to just say something in response to these remarks before we start a round of questions?
Well, I just want to say what a wonderful set of responses to the lecture. I know that Maury was a bit pessimistic, but his pessimism had a lot of truth in it. It is true that developed countries, particularly the US, have had periods of waxing and waning about the benefits of multilateralism and the global trading system. But that struck me when you said it. Waxing and waning is okay, but recognizing the fundamental chaos that would occur if the waning goes too far is really essential. And that is why I keep repeating, and people will be sick of hearing me say this, that the world needs to remember that 75% of world trade is taking place on WTO terms. For all the disruption we see now, that's a huge number. And if you wane too much, it would really result in a big lose-lose for the world. So I wanted to just pick up on that. I also like your willing countries cooperation advice. It may come to that. Of course, at the WTO, we can't work with willing countries only. We have to work with everybody. But there's some wisdom in what you're saying. Sometimes willing countries may come together to lead the way in trying to find the best answers. And I like best of all when you said something about let me see if I can find it, because I actually wrote it down. We need to find the right policies and answers, something to that effect. We need to know what to do.
I wrote it down too.
Yeah.
What we should do. What we can do.
In order to figure out what we can do. And that's exactly right. That's why we need to press on with things like trying to find an interoperable global pricing approach. If we know what we should do, then maybe then we can figure out how we can do it. Thank you. And Minouche, wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to both of you. You know, your 4 points about why politicians find it so hard, that's so true. I really share what you have to say. And it's very easy to have a zero-sum view of the world, because that is very easy to sell. And we've not done enough to really put out why global trade. I don't think the average person on the street really knows this thing we are talking about the fundamental fact that their day-to-day living depends on a set of rules in somewhere which is completely esoteric to them in Geneva that they don't know about. I think we need to do more to educate about that. And of course, we totally agree that using trade as trade tools as a sledgehammer. What did you call it? If you have a hammer, everything will be a nail. Yeah. That's the way we feel right now, the WTO. Everything is and can be solved using trade tools. And I think to the extent we can find the right tools for the right problems, it would really be helpful. So I enjoyed the comments enormously. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start the discussion off with Maury's quote, which I also wrote down. We should know what we should do before we can decide what we can do. Mm-hmm. The reality is, what we should do often is very complicated to communicate relative to somebody saying, he's taking your job, and I want to stop that. how do we get better on communicating the benefits of trade? I think this is a theme that all three of you have raised. What's missing? I mean, Ngozi, you've been on international platforms, so you have to persuade people. How do you talk to a US senator and say, you know, this is where we should be going?
Well, since I've actually done it.
Yeah, absolutely.
To talk to US senators, it's quite a tall order because of some of the things that Minouche said. The world is very complex, and if you can reduce it to an easy, they're against you, they're taking your jobs and so on, it makes your life and your politics so much easier. But there are senators and there are politicians who are willing to listen to the truth. I think, Raghu, the key is in not being tired of repeating the fundamentals of what trade delivers. I think over time, my theory is we've come to take it for granted. It's like the air you breathe. Until you start suffocating, you won't notice that you don't have enough air. People have completely taken trade for granted, in a way. When I say taking it for granted, I mean the fact that they can get goods and services quite easily from one part of the world to the other. It's just like things that happen normally. So they don't think about what lies behind it. And I think we need, being able to articulate that, remind the senators and politicians about that and the good it has delivered, how it has lowered costs, the disinflationary impacts of having these supply chains. Not too concentrated, we're not for that. And the fact that what would happen if goods and services really were done in another way through the import substitution policies or approaches that are now being. So talking to them about that and hoping they can talk to their populations. But I also submit that we need to get out to ordinary people more. We need to find ways and means. So just talking to politicians is not good enough. I think we need to find ways to reach out to civil society, to help. The private sector does the trading, not governments. They also have to speak up. All that is needed.
Maury?
Yeah.
Maury, go first.
No, that's a really fantastic point, that trade is so integrated in our lives. We depend on it so much, and it's generally so smooth that we take it for granted. It's sort of like your car starts in the morning, and you don't really say, "Wow, my car started." You just, but when it breaks, then you know you're really in trouble, and it's a huge disruption. But I've actually participated in some of these efforts to try to get people to understand about trade. When I was in the Obama White House, TPP was being negotiated, and at that time, there was a lot of skepticism about trade on the Democratic side. The Republicans were very much, for the most part, on board with trade, with the exception of some senators from Rust Belt states who were very skeptical. And we put out a white paper on benefits of trade, which had very little impact. At the end of the day, the Trade Promotion Authority that President Obama was seeking to pursue TPP was approved in the Congress, but with very, very few Democratic votes. And it was interesting, particularly to look at the Senate, because states on the coasts with very strong and obvious trading relationships, those were where the Democratic Senate votes came from. So, it was possible to make that argument. But for many others, the focus was on job losses, globalization, and so on. So it's very hard, and it's become much harder now when both major parties in the United States are against trade. The Republican program is one of bringing back manufacturing, which is going to be very hard to do through tariffs. And even in the White House, I'm told trade is a dirty word. So,
White House dirty.
it's a challenge. And lectures from economists only go so far. I think what has started to come through a little bit in the current political climate is this idea that tariffs will raise the prices of goods that you depend on. And, but even that is debated, with many people denying the obvious reality. So, then it comes down to the credibility of economists. And for various reasons, including the global financial crisis, economists' credibility is not at an all-time high.
So do we have to see a breakdown of the system and to know that it's not smoothly available to actually recognize the benefits once again?
I mean, we would hope not, but of course the prologue to the miracle at Bretton Woods was a depression, a breakdown of the system, wartime controls and shortages, which I think also played a role in the public consciousness that things don't always go smoothly if markets are not working.
Well, I just think we have to remind people of the positive benefits. If you think about it, the goods in our lives whose relative prices have come down are the things that are traded. So if you think about the price of manufactured goods, electronics, clothing, all of that stuff has become much cheaper in relative terms, whereas the costs of things, and you can tell I used to be a central banker like Raghu, so prices matter, inflation matters a lot. The prices that have gone up are the things that are not traded. Housing, healthcare, education, those are the things that have become much more expensive in our lives. And I think that's such a good illustration of the power of trade to improve consumer welfare. I think the other piece is that, I don't think you'll ever get people to be positive about trade unless you mitigate the downsides and have a social safety net. I think the biggest issue in the United States, for example, is the lack of a social safety net, and the fact that if you lose your job, unemployment is very ungenerous, worker reskilling and retraining is very, very poor. The ability to move is very low if you're stuck in housing you can't afford in where the jobs are. And so unless that system of a safety net is created, you're always going to have this high degree of anxiety about trade disruption. And that's a big ask.
As well as the point you made about trade adjustment. If you don't have a decent system of trade adjustment,
exactly.
The Scandinavian countries have managed volatility in trade by having a very effective system of trade adjustment, which...
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that it would also, of course, when you're representing a district where jobs are being lost due to technology and it's partially blamed on trade, it's not easy, but pointing out that maybe jobs are being created elsewhere. We don't talk enough about the jobs in services. We have, and I think no matter what is happening, if the US wants to bring back manufacturing, but it can never be like the heydays. It's never going to be the manufacturing center. But the US is a power in services. And if we could talk about these jobs, there's somehow the notion that services jobs are not as good jobs, quote unquote, as those created. There's been this picture painted. So I think, also talking about that, pointing out about job creation in services, which for many young people actually is more attractive now. We're seeing places where in the United States manufacturing jobs have come, and there's no one to take them because young people are more interested in jobs that are in services, especially the digitally delivered services trade that we talked about.
Absolutely, and what is interesting is very few people know the world's biggest exporter of services is in the United States.
Exactly.
But it seems to be something that's not...
But even it goes even further that, we always tend to publicize the negatives. So if there's import competition, people lose their jobs. Having a better social safety net would indeed be better for mitigating those issues. But when we import more, we also export more. It's not actually true that trade itself reduces manufacturing jobs. The research on the China shock, for example, shows that more export more jobs were created in export industries than were lost in import competing industries. So there's a positive side, but it never gets covered because bad news is of more interest in some sense than good news.
Even in academia, right? Everybody knows the China shock adverse newspapers. Nobody pays enough attention to the positive side of it.
And that's not to minimize the harm to folks who lose their jobs. It's terrible, but there is another side of the picture.
Anyway, Raghu, let me say that everyone is still paying their dues at the WTO. So I just wanted to lighten the atmosphere a bit. You know, when they stop paying, then we know we're in trouble. So somewhere, even though we're saying all this, I think they're responsible. They're Congress people and senators and people in the administration who know about this 75%, and they still keep their presence at the WTO.
Well, let me ask a last question, then open it up to a question from the audience. We have an election in the United States in a couple of weeks. It may turn more isolationist. Let me not say who will make it turn more isolationist, but leave it as a possibility. Can the world still move ahead in that kind of environment in preserving openness? Is it possible, Maury, to your point, the US turns back and forth, but if the period of turning down is long, is it possible to move ahead without the United States? Is it in fact time for the world to do that? Or is the US reflecting what's happening in the rest of the world? So it's really a world problem rather than a US problem. Anybody, I know this is a...
Let Maury go first.
Maury, you go first.
You want the pessimistic view, right? No, there are definitely challenges throughout the world, and in some sense, populism is on the rise in many places. The specific backlash toward trade per se, I think, has been stronger in the U.S. than other places, and it's in part because the U.S. is bigger. And if you're a small open economy, you know that you're dependent on trade. But it may indeed be that if the U.S. is turning inward, let's say, to a greater extent and is not participating, there needs to be even more of a plurilateral approach than has been taken in many areas. And that's been successful in a number of instances. And again, there may be coalitions of the willing who have more open arrangements. Now we already have that with a wide range of free trade areas, and so it's not totally unprecedented. But it may be that the U.S. retreats, and we would hope at some stage comes back, but the rest of the world can't afford to stand still on issues like climate and disease and the many other areas where cooperation is needed. Of course, the cooperation won't be as effective if it's not universal, but countries still have to try.
I mean, I think one risk is that we start to see a rise of regionalism again. And regionalism, we all know, is the second best solution to multilateral trading. But it may not be a bad thing if the option is nothing. I think also that for many emerging markets in particular, they're under huge pressure to take sides, and they will be under pressure. And I think there's huge resistance to that. And they quite rightly say, we don't want to take sides. We want to trade openly with China and the United States. And so I think regionalism is a second best alternative. And I would also just say, if that happens, it becomes even more important that organizations like the WTO and the Fund and the Bank kind of keep the flame of multilateralism alive during that period and keep focusing and proselytizing about what we should be doing, even if we can't do it in that moment, because it will wax and wane, and then you got to be ready when it waxes.
Last word.
Yeah. Well, I think, of course, it would be difficult, Raghu, and one would hope that scenario may not come about, but it may. And it's not really unknown for the US to retreat from certain organizations or certain agreements or certain things at a point in time. And I think that may happen. But the issue is what the rest of the world does, because trade is so central. I mean, trade to GDP ratio of the US is about 13 to 14%. China about 25 to 28%. You know, when you come to Europe and you look at countries whose trade to GDP ratio is so much larger, and small open economies, like you said, there are some that cannot afford. They cannot exist without being part of the world trading system. So that's point one. Even relying so much on food, on trade for their daily ability to eat. Japan is a net food importer for 60% of its food requirements. So if Japan doesn't have trade, what is it going to do? It means it can't even feed its population. 1 in 4 calories consumed in the world is traded. 1 in 4. Many people don't know that. So it's very easy to say retreat. Many cannot afford to do so. So I think it will continue, is what I would say. Brazil cannot afford not to sell $20 billion worth of soybeans to China every year. It just cannot. So there are certain facts. The rest of the world will continue to trade, and the US may not be part of it. And I think when the time is propitious, the US will come back.
We have time for one question. If anybody, there are mics there. Whoever hits the mic first gets the chance to ask the question. Gentleman there, go ahead.
Hello, yes, I'm Robert Blum, I'm an economist. Is the role of government in the economy the problem, or a big aspect of the problem? And I'm thinking of cases where in a country a government can commandeer the economy and can commandeer production versus countries where it's disaggregated. It's companies that make decisions, so a country can have an overall trade strategy. And as well, governments subsidize.
I think the question is clear.
And governments subsidize, are the ones that subsidize. And the final point, Kristalina talked about how governments are maxed out when it comes to borrowing. And then AJ says, for World Bank, that we've got to tap the resources of the private sector. If governments can't increase contributions, we got to, the private sector's out there and has that potential. So isn't there an underlying, very important issue that gets neglected? Because when we look at GDP, we just look at GDP as trade,
sir, thank you very much.
As consumption and production.
Thank you.
But government...
We'll get the answers from the panel now. Yeah. Who would like to take that?
I want to make sure I understood the question, because I didn't, it was echoing.
Are governments the problem? Governments in terms of, I would guess, industrial policies, subsidies, are they what is disconcerting other countries, and then you have this move towards erecting trade barriers?
Well, I said in my speech, or maybe, sorry, it wasn't in my speech, yesterday I said in another forum that, yes, one can understand the complaints about unlevel playing field and subsidies and lack of transparency on subsidies. And the complaint at the WTO, all members complain about this lack of transparency. So people think it's only the US and maybe EU complaining about China, but China complains about agricultural subsidies of others. The US complains of industrial subsidies of China. Now everybody's complaining about everybody's green subsidies. So there's really discontent all around about the issues of subsidies, unfair practices. But of course, the issue about China has been longstanding, and we've been in dialogue with China, for instance, that better transparency, that more transparency, more declaration is better. And we've just done a China trade policy review where we found more subsidies, we discussed with the government, and I must say, at the end, they agreed that we publish this, and it's now publicly available, and we have this subsidies platform. So to some extent, we have this complaint. But is the answer to that to retreat to protectionism and tit-for-tat measures? That's the key question. What is the solution to unlevel playing field? We've almost always maintained that it is to try and look at the existing rules that govern our subsidies and countervailing measures agreement. As I said openly, I don't think it's fit for purpose. I think that rather than retreat, and I'm saying this advisedly, we need to reform it. We need to say the world is changing. How do we relook at our existing agreements to bring them up to speed to solve 21st century problems? How do we bring them up to speed so we can trust each other and stop at making accusations? That is the way to go. The way certainly not to go is to continue to throw accusations at each other and go for tit-for-tat measures that makes everybody worse off.
Well, that's a great way to end this panel. Let me thank the panelists, especially Ngozi, for that wonderful speech and the chance for us to all talk about one of the great issues of our time, trade. Thank you very much.